welcome to the second session. We are talking about grief, and today we'll be discussing about the stages of grief. So, Kubler-Ross had originally he had said that there are these five stages of grief that take place that the individual goes through. So it starts from denial and ends at acceptance. We'll go stage by stage at every step and discuss how a person feels, and then we will discuss what is how the theory is and how in practicality we go through the stages and what happens. So today we are again here with Aditi. She's a clinical psychologist. Both of us are working at AIMS together at the neurology department. It's good to have all of you here on a very sunny evening. And the first stage that was introduced is denial. So by the word denial, we know that something that we are not ready to accept, which is something which actually occurs when anyone is faced by a sudden, and grief, as we know, is a very sudden experience that any individual goes through. So it is that phase where the person does not know how to process or even wants to acknowledge that the situation has taken place. I think Aditi will help us understand it better with an example. Over to you, Aditi.
Thank you so much, Sharna, for inviting me again. Yes, as we are discussing about the stages of grief, the first stage, according to the Kubler-Ross model, is the denial. As you rightly pointed, it's the stage of disbelief and shock where people don't find it very difficult to accept what has happened. Let's say when someone close passed away, the first reaction comes like a shock or a disbelief. Like, I don't think it's right, or maybe the news is wrong. I think we should recheck. Or if something really bad happens, let's say a sudden day off, then we tend to recheck the mail, reread the mail that, okay, is it only to us or was it sent to us by mistake? So this is the stage of denial where where it's basically like a buffer or a mask system that helps the body and our mind to protect from the shock that has happened. So we try to, protect ourselves from the news, which eventually gets proceeded to the next stage called the anger. Would you like to discuss about the anger?
Yeah. So anger is very loosely put as that how come something like this happened to me? It is that rage, that emotion, because since our ideal stage is acceptance, and to reach that it takes a lot of courage and processing to do. Anger is that stage where the body is just raging out that okay, this is the first time it's acknowledging that a grief has struck, like there is some loss. That acknowledgement has now hit the body that okay, there is something that is no more there in my life. And then the first negative emotion that comes is anger, where the person is not understanding where or how to manage the heaviness, or how to displace, or even to acknowledge that uncertainty that what will happen next. So anger then is that one emotion which comes out, which the person processes. And if you could just tell us with example, if the same like the job example that you're telling, how does the person go through it?
Sure. Like you rightly pointed here, anger is the first emotion that they experience after the grief sets in, one of the first emotions, and followed by sadness, confusion. So it's basically somewhere suggesting that now the body is processing into the process of grief, and somewhere the mask of the denial is setting off. So we are now somewhere, processing that entire event, like what happened, how did it happen. So the common examples that we see here is. Let's say if somebody has, in case of a terminal illness, if someone passed away, our anger reaction goes in like, I think something wrong must have happened by the medical practitioner. Something wrong must have happened by them, or maybe like there's this anger which gets directed towards people externally or internally as well. I could have done something wrong, or maybe how did that happen? So we hear so many instances of these. Hello,
Yeah.
So we hear so many violences being inflicted. So it's somewhere not one of the reasons could be the anger of the grief setting in when they lose a dear one. Again, it could be directed towards a human being or an inanimate object or anything else, but it just it sets in. So it can also be towards the deceased person, like why did they leave us? So it's a process of setting the grief setting in, which is then followed by the bargaining stage, which I think you can highlight about it.
So what happens is, initially, the first thing that we do is we try to blame the outside world. That is why anger comes in. That the outside world, something might have gone wrong there. That But then slowly, when the feeling, we are sitting with the feeling for a more period of time, we realize, then we start to retrace our steps. That what could we have done? Like, how could we have avoided the situation? As rightly said, that in a job, then you again keep questioning that what are the things that you could have done better so that the outcome would not have reached there. So then
Mm.
the bargaining starts to take place, that the things that could be fixed. But again, we know that that is there in the past. But bargaining again becomes a very difficult emotion to handle, because you are trying to shift the onus on yourself, that the things that you could have done. And you could just enlighten us that, how it becomes tough.
Sure. So this bargaining stage is accompanied by the feeling of helplessness and vulnerability, where we are trying to now, make or come into terms with what just happened. Now, the anger, since the rage has now lowered its intensity, I would not say it is extinguished; it stays. But then
Right.
now we are trying to again process and move ahead and try to find a newer meaning to it. So bargaining step is crucial. So here we try to contemplate and think like, if this could have done, we could have done this way. So if then statements start resurfacing here, like I could have done, or maybe if I could have taken from it to another doctor, or if I could have applied or to another job much before. So these things, they start setting in, like the other possibilities which we could have done to protect ourselves from experiencing this pain. So I think bargaining, it takes time for us to come into terms with it. And bargaining, I think, is a crucial stage to acknowledge grief, because here we are contemplating for the first time after the grief has set in that, okay, now how do we deal with it?
Right. Very rightly said. I think this is then this once this bargaining phase is there, the next phase that is discussed is depression. So after you have put the onus on the world that, how could this happen? How could they leave? Coming to, what I could have done to,
Mm.
make any change in the outcome, comes the depression stage, where you are feeling that helplessness, that hopelessness, where you suddenly feel that no situation is in our control, that how we could have avoided. Right now there's no point thinking, and suddenly you're hit with this huge emotion of sadness, where you don't know how to function, you don't know what to do, and nothing makes you feel happy. It's more
Mm.
like, oh, it happened. You're just sitting with the feeling, you're lingering with the feeling that this loss has
Yeah.
taken place, and you don't know how to process it anymore, how to get up and move ahead with your life. Right,
Yeah.
Aditi?
Uh, Very well said here, because this depression, this phase is different from the clinical depression that we uh, usually see. This is like a stage of a grief which is very natural and universally seen in the process of overcoming griefs. So that helplessness, the low mood, crying spells, coming into realization that, okay, the a person has gone, or maybe the job is no longer there, and now how do we come into terms with it? So we see a lot of behavioral psychological changes when the event starts setting in. Somewhere it is
Right.
helping us. This process helps us to navigate through the next direction, that is to integrate, like how do we move ahead with this. Here also the symptoms and features are very similar to that of a clinical depressive stage, but it's not actually a diagnosis here. It's just like a stage where we are coming into terms with it, about the loss that has happened. And somewhere after this stage is that leads to the stage of acceptance, where we are
Right.
slowly and steadily coming into terms with it. Would you like to highlight about the acceptance part?
See, here it is mostly that you have sit with you processed that whole situation, that whole feeling. As we discussed in our last session, that the processing time is very different from individual to individual. Someone might take a month, to someone might take 6 months. Very personal or individual characteristics, but that is when you have processed it. Now you're accepting that, okay, this has happened, and now what next? Because either way, life is moving on. We had even mentioned that maybe in that period of time, as social support, it's not necessary to say that this phase will pass by. But when the person slowly reaches that stage of acceptance, they realize that, okay, this will also pass by. And I think you can just enlighten us a little more on how people move ahead from here.
So the duration here, so sometimes we come across these questions like, how long does it take for a person to overcome a grief? Now, like we understand it's a personal journey, and everybody takes their own time, and there is no such set standard that someone needs this much, and it's their own unique journey, and so many factors are there: social support, their occupational support, their standing, and these factors somewhere determine how they overcome a grief. And here, let's say when the common understanding here is that like we explain this model, it seems like a very linear fashion. That it's like,
Yeah.
it's very simple. It's from denial to then anger and then bargaining and then depression and acceptance. It seems such a easy step. But in reality, let's say when in the practical cases that we see, the first thing that we understand is that it's a non-linear process. Sometimes we'll experience denial, anger, reach to the bargaining phase, and then again go back to anger because it's our own journey here. So sometimes we can go to the depressive phase and again go back to anger because we never know something might trigger us, or there could be some old past memories that can resurface while we are coping up with the grief. Any remembrance, especially the important, let's for example, important dates, the birthdays or the anniversaries that can remind us of the person, the photographs or the albums, or mere mentioning of the person in another conversation can take us back to that process of grief. It's something like it just keeps we have to go through it. Some and it's not we cannot just avoid it anytime. Any
These
more?
are
Do you feel like adding? Yeah, sure.
yeah, these are the times when if we avoid, they turn to complicated grief. Then
Yes.
that's when it becomes tough. We feel that if we'll avoid, it'll be easier for us to deal with the situation. Actually, that is a myth.
Mm. It cannot be avoided. Here, it waits patiently for us to complete our work and then get back to it. Like
Creeps in.
usually yeah, it creeps in, and it creeps in through different forms. We never know how it can come in, but it does through either through emotional or through interpersonal relations or even through bodily symptoms.
Right. And here, the only tip I would like to give is that the only way to it is through it. You have
Yeah.
to go through the tunnel to come out of it. And the fact that, no matter how linear the process was explained theoretically, practically it is more like a looping series that we keep going up and down the stages. If you realize, if you are a part of a social support for someone who's going through grief and you're understanding that these are the things which trigger the person more, try to make sure that you can reduce those triggers for yourself or the other person. That will make the process a little easier for them to go through, because it's not that we can completely protect the person from the triggers, but at least if we are seeing that, say, some song or some photo or something which is triggering them every now and then, at least try to minimize those triggers in their environment in the initial stages.
Yes, it does make sense. Yes, rightly put. Here, some behavioral experiments initially to change the environment or to do something or keep themselves involved in a way so that we can minimize the triggers, not eliminate it completely, but just try to minimize as much as possible because we're still coping up with the process. I feel grief, like there could be an explain. It seems like a wound. If a metaphor can explain it, grief is like a wound, which just when it hits, it's really painful and it takes time to heal. So slowly and steadily we'll see that the wound is healing and eventually it leaves behind the scar. So so the scar somewhere just reminds us that we went through the grief. However, the intensity of the pain may have reduced to a great extent.
Right, right. I think, I just hope that this has made it a little clear for people who are going through grief, or people who around you are going through grief, so that you can also understand that, in at which stage they are, so that even it becomes for you as the caregiver also to know what to do. Say if someone is bargaining with themselves that, what they could have done, and if you're trying to put the blame on other people, you'll not be really matching with where they are. So it's good to even know that where the person is in their processing, so that you can say appropriate things to be there for them.
Yes, I think so. Being like a support system has a very plays a fundamental role in coping up with grief. So a healthy support system with non-judgmental or empathetic or compassionate view towards the person can really ease in the process or the journey of grief. Though it's an individual journey, but I think
Right.
it works.
We've clearly stated the stages of grief. We have given a good introduction in our last session. Maybe next session we can discuss a little bit more about the misconceptions that take place, or the myths that there are, like a quick 5-minute session where we are just discussing, so that people are aware that maybe just because something is going on for a really long time does not make it true, and we can address a few questions in the audience that day, that what are the things that they feel would be
Hmm.
grief, and then what
Sure.
actually reality is processing. So I think that is what we can do for our next session. We can plan that, the misconceptions, so that it's easier. It makes it more easy to identify when the person is going through grief. So
Yes, I think
Anything
it
that
makes.
you'd like to say before we wrap up today's session?
I think it's really a nice educative session that we have, and I would yeah really look forward to addressing the myths and also somewhere add the common concerns we see when we the concerns and the issues that we as an individual feel when we are noticing our near and dear ones going through grief.
Right.
So we can empathetically, address all the concerns and the myths associated with grief in the grieving process.
Correct, correct. I think thank you all for joining in today. It's